was a quiet spring morning in 2025 when a construction crew working on a major renovation project in Brooklyn, New York, uncovered something that no one had expected. The workers were tasked with clearing out the old dilapidated warehouse on the corner of Water Street and Atlantic Avenue, a building that had been standing since the early 1900s. It was a typical industrial structure, weathered by time, with rusted metal beams, crumbling brick walls, and a floor that had seen better days. The warehouse, once part of the bustling shipping industry, had long been abandoned, but now it was set to be transformed into luxury apartments, a sign of the gentrification sweeping through Brooklyn. As the workers began tearing up the old concrete flooring to prepare for the new building's foundation, one of the crew members, a man named Jack Rizzo, noticed something unusual. Around 10 a.m., as Jack's jackhammer struck the ground in the far corner of the warehouse, he hit something solid, a sound unlike the usual thud of concrete. At first, he thought it was just an old pipe or some hidden debris, something that often pops up in renovations of buildings this old. But as the hammer continued to pound into the ground, he realized this was something different. The floor wasn't giving way as it should. Jack bent down and scraped at the concrete dust. He saw something that looked metallic. As he scraped away the grime, a flash of chrome appeared. It was unmistakable, a car bumper. He stood up, heart racing, and called his foreman over. Carlos Martinez, a man who'd been in the demolition business for over 30 years, approached the site, skeptical at first. "What's the big deal?" Carlos asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Just a car bumper, probably from an old junker someone abandoned years ago." But as Jack and Carlos began clearing away more concrete, the shape of the object became clearer. It wasn't just a bumper, it was the back of a vintage car. The unmistakable tail fins of a 1960s American classic slowly emerged from the concrete, coated in years of dust and grime. Carlos immediately stopped the work. He knew this wasn't just a random find. They needed to call in the authorities. By noon, the police had arrived. Detectives from the Brooklyn precinct, alongside forensic specialists, began carefully digging around the car. It wasn't long before they realized they weren't dealing with a simple abandoned vehicle. They were about to uncover something far more significant, a car buried under the warehouse floor for over 60 years. The car, a 1965 Lincoln Continental, was revealed after days of careful excavation. It had been buried under a solid foundation of concrete, its once shiny chrome now corroded and dull. But what really caught the attention of the investigators wasn't just the car, it was what was inside. Behind the driver's seat, in the front of the Lincoln, lay a human skeleton. The body, still seated, as if it had been left there just yesterday, was wearing what remained of a suit, its fabric faded and deteriorated by the decades it had spent hidden underground. The hands of the skeleton rested on the steering wheel, a grim reminder that whoever had been buried here had met a violent end. As the forensic team carefully documented the scene, it became clear that this wasn't a normal car burial. The positioning of the car and the way the body was found indicated something deliberate, something well planned. The vehicle had been driven into this warehouse's corner, its owner sitting in the driver's seat, perhaps in the middle of a meeting or a ride when the end had come. The remains were examined closely. The clothing, although worn, was enough to suggest that the person had been someone of importance. But it wasn't just the clothing that stood out. The body had been placed in a specific way, with the arms positioned near the wheel. The leather seats, despite the wear, had also helped preserve the body in place, keeping the skeleton largely intact. As investigators began to piece together the evidence, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary missing person case. The car had been intentionally sealed, buried under layers of concrete, and left there for decades. This wasn't a simple crime or an accidental burial. This was a cover-up of something far darker. By late afternoon, the mystery began to unravel. Through the process of forensic analysis and investigation, the body was quickly identified. The man buried in the car was Salvatore "Sammy" Donatello, a notorious New York Mafia boss who had vanished without a trace in 1965. Sammy Donatello had been a significant figure in the underworld of New York City, known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to control several illegal operations across the city. He had earned both respect and fear. Born in 1923 in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents, Sammy had risen through the ranks of the Mafia at a young age. By the time he was in his 30s, he had already become one of the key players in the criminal network that operated in the heart of New York. Donatello was known for his iron-fisted rule over the docks, where he controlled extortion rackets, illegal gambling, and labor unions. He had a reputation for being both a charming businessman and a brutal enforcer. No one dared cross Sammy, at least not openly. He had made countless enemies over the years, both within and outside his organization, but his power and influence remained unchallenged, until, that is, he mysteriously disappeared. The year was 1965, and Donatello's disappearance shocked the city. One day he was there, conducting business with his usual flair. The next, he was gone. His family, friends, and associates had no idea where he went. No one heard from him again. The police had their suspicions, but no one ever came forward with solid evidence. Sammy Donatello had simply vanished. Rumors swirled in the criminal underworld. Some said he had been killed in a mob hit over a deal gone wrong. Others whispered that he had been betrayed by someone close to him, someone he had trusted. Some even suggested he had staged his disappearance to escape the increasing pressure from law enforcement. But in the end, no one knew for sure. For over 60 years, the case remained unsolved. Sammy Donatello's disappearance became one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in Mafia history, and his name became part of New York's criminal folklore. Over time, people forgot the details. The city changed. Generations passed, and with them, the whispers of his fate faded into the background. But now, in 2025, after decades of mystery and unanswered questions, the truth had finally emerged. Sammy Donatello was dead, and he had been buried under a warehouse floor for 60 years. The discovery of his body in the Lincoln Continental would soon become the talk of the town, sending shockwaves through the Mafia community and the city's law enforcement. But the mystery didn't end there. The more investigators dug into Sammy's past, the more they realized that his death wasn't just a simple mob hit. It was a well-organized, well-executed plan to silence him forever. As the news of the discovery spread, it wasn't just the authorities who wanted answers. The people who knew Sammy, the ones who had worked alongside him, began to stir. Would the truth about his death ever fully come to light, or would it remain another buried secret of New York's Mafia underworld? To understand how Sammy Donatello ended up buried beneath concrete for 6 decades, investigators would need to delve deeper into the web of crime, betrayal, and power that defined the world he had lived in. But that, as they would soon find out, would be the beginning of a far bigger story. The discovery of Sammy Donatello's body buried in the Lincoln Continental sent shockwaves through New York, but it also reignited long-forgotten questions about the Mafia's grip on the city in the 1960s. For years, Sammy's disappearance had been one of the most whispered-about events in the criminal world, but now, with the skeletal remains of the infamous mob boss finally uncovered, people began to wonder, who had been behind it? The New York Police Department immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives from the Organized Crime Division, who had spent years tracking down leads on various Mafia families, began piecing together the events surrounding Sammy's death. Their investigation soon revealed an intricate web of criminal activity, power struggles, and betrayal. Sammy had made a lot of enemies over the years, and he had earned a reputation as a hard-nosed businessman. Those who worked with him saw a man who demanded loyalty above all else. Sammy had built his criminal empire by controlling multiple lucrative rackets: extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor unions. He didn't just manage his operations. He ran them with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But as with all powerful men, Sammy's rise to the top had come at a cost. While he was respected for his business acumen, he had also earned the hatred of many, especially those who were on the losing end of his deals. In the volatile world of the Mafia, alliances were fragile and betrayal was inevitable. But who would want Sammy gone? In the 1960s, the Mafia was at its peak in New York, with several powerful families vying for control of the city's criminal activities. The 5 families, which included the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, were all heavily involved in the city's illegal operations. Sammy, however, had never been tied to any one of the 5. His power lay in his ability to work with all of them. He had connections everywhere, and it made him invaluable to the underworld, but it also made him a target. There were rumors, whispers really, that Sammy had been on the verge of striking a deal with the FBI. With increasing law enforcement pressure, some in his inner circle believed that Sammy might be looking for a way out of the criminal world, or worse, ready to turn on his associates. The disappearance. Sammy's disappearance on August 18, 1965, had left everyone guessing. It was a Thursday night when he left his home in his beloved Lincoln Continental. According to his wife, Maria, the last conversation she had with Sammy was about a business meeting he had to attend. But when he didn't return by midnight, Maria grew concerned. By the time Friday morning arrived, Sammy was still nowhere to be found. His wife, his closest associates, and even his rivals in the underworld had no idea where he had gone. His car, his iconic 1965 Lincoln, was missing, and so was he. At first, many assumed that Sammy had just taken off for a while, maybe to lay low and avoid the heat. But as the days turned into weeks, the uncertainty grew. The investigation into Sammy's disappearance was initially treated with a certain level of indifference by the police. After all, Sammy Donatello wasn't exactly a law-abiding citizen. His connections to organized crime had been well known for years, and the police suspected he may have just fled the scene of an impending bust or fallout from a deal gone wrong. But when no one heard from Sammy and the Lincoln remained missing, the case began to take on a darker tone. Maria, devastated by the absence of her husband, knew something was terribly wrong. As the weeks stretched on with no sign of Sammy, she began to demand answers. Her pleas to the police were ignored. She even reached out to some of the more influential figures within the Mafia community, hoping they would know something. But no one seemed to have any answers. Everyone who might have known where Sammy was or what had happened to him kept quiet. In the end, Maria was forced to live in the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing where her husband had gone. Some speculated that Sammy had been killed over a mob-related dispute. Others believed that a fellow mobster, perhaps someone close to him, had betrayed him. But the truth remained elusive. For decades, the case of Sammy Donatello's disappearance was shelved, left to collect dust in the cold files of the NYPD's unsolved cases. A secret buried for decades. Over the years, Sammy's name continued to echo through the halls of New York's criminal underground. His disappearance remained a haunting mystery, but the city, ever-changing and fast-paced, moved on. The years passed, and the Mafia's influence in New York began to decline. Law enforcement efforts intensified, and many old Mafia families faded into the shadows. The buildings in the city were redeveloped, and the areas where Sammy had once held sway transformed. But through it all, the secret of what had happened to Sammy Donatello remained buried beneath layers of concrete. That was until 2025, when the construction workers on Water Street began their demolition work. When they first uncovered the chrome bumper of the 1965 Lincoln, it was as if the past had risen from the ashes. They had no idea that the car they were unearthing had been buried there deliberately. A tomb, a grave, concealed in a place no one would think to look. And yet, 60 years after Sammy Donatello vanished, the past had come knocking. The body in the car was a clear sign that someone wanted to make sure he was gone forever. But why? Who had gone through such elaborate efforts to conceal Sammy's death? It didn't take long for the investigators to uncover a shocking detail. The construction crew working on the warehouse's foundation had uncovered something far more sinister than just an old car. They had found the remnants of a mob boss who had been buried with a plan in mind, a plan that stretched far beyond a typical mob hit. Whoever had orchestrated Sammy's murder and burial had done so with a level of precision that suggested someone with power, someone with connections. The investigation begins. As the details of Sammy's death began to unfold, investigators started looking into everyone who might have had a reason to kill him. His family, his friends, and his rivals were all under suspicion. The authorities knew that the answer to Sammy's disappearance lay buried in the past. But would they be able to piece together the full story, or would Sammy Donatello remain another Mafia mystery that would never be solved? What the detectives quickly realized was that the web surrounding Sammy's disappearance was far more tangled than they had ever imagined. Sammy hadn't just been buried under a warehouse. He had been buried under a network of lies, corruption, and hidden truths that stretched across New York's criminal landscape. As investigators dove deeper into the mystery of Sammy Donatello's death, one thing became clear. The Mafia had changed, but the ghosts of its past were far from gone. The discovery of Sammy Donatello's body had reopened old wounds in the criminal world. For years, those who were part of the Mafia had kept their silence about his disappearance, but now the past was forcing its way into the present. With the Lincoln Continental and the skeletal remains discovered under the warehouse, detectives were faced with more than just a cold case. They were confronting a legacy of secrets, lies, and old rivalries that had been buried just as deep as Sammy himself. The investigation was gaining momentum. In the weeks following the discovery, detectives began to dig into Sammy's last known movements and contacts. Every detail mattered, every interaction was scrutinized. In the underworld, no one was ever truly forgotten, and Sammy's name still carried weight. His disappearance in 1965 had left a hole, but now the hole was being filled with uncomfortable truths. Sammy had always been someone who played all sides of the Mafia game. While the 5 families of New York were fighting for control over the city's criminal enterprises, Sammy had positioned himself as a neutral party, a man who could work with anyone. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the Mafia made him an asset, but it also made him dangerous to those who saw him as a threat. Over the years, Sammy had managed to keep a delicate balance between the families. He wasn't necessarily a boss of any one family, but his influence spread across all of them. This unique position made him valuable, but also expendable. As the investigation unfolded, detectives learned that Sammy had recently become more of a target. While he had always been able to maintain peace between the families, the landscape of the Mafia in the 1960s was changing. New, younger faces were rising through the ranks, hungry for power and control. Sammy had been at the top for so long that it was only a matter of time before someone came for him. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Sammy had been more secretive than usual. Some of his closest associates reported that he had been meeting with people he normally didn't associate with, including members of the Gambino family. This was strange. Sammy had always steered clear of dealing directly with one family more than the others. But as law enforcement dug deeper, they discovered that Sammy had been working on something big, something that could have upset the power balance in New York's criminal underworld. It was suggested that Sammy had been on the verge of forming an alliance with one of the most powerful Mafia families in the city, the Gambino family. If true, this could have been a huge shift in the power dynamics between the 5 families. The Gambino family was led by Carlo Gambino, one of the most powerful and respected figures in the Mafia world. Sammy had been in talks to form an alliance, but this was dangerous. If someone wanted to weaken the Gambinos or take over Sammy's operations, a deal with them would be seen as a betrayal by other factions. The idea of Sammy trying to break away from the pack, aligning himself with a single family, or even trying to go legit by striking deals with the authorities made a few people nervous. As the rumors spread, Sammy's alliances began to shift and his enemies grew restless. By the time Sammy vanished, there had already been whispers of his potential betrayal. Some believed he was preparing to strike a deal with the FBI, while others thought he might have been planning to leave the criminal life behind. For those in his inner circle, however, it was a different story. They believed Sammy had been targeted by those closest to him, someone who saw him as a threat to their own power. The murder had been carefully planned. Whoever killed Sammy wanted to ensure that no one would be able to connect the dots between his disappearance and the higher-ups involved. His body had been disposed of with precision, hidden under concrete in a place no one would ever think to look. Even after 6 decades, no one had discovered the truth until the workers at the warehouse on Water Street uncovered the car. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that Sammy's death had been a calculated operation. The authorities began to focus on 2 main theories. First, that Sammy had been murdered by members of a rival family, and second, that he had been silenced by someone within his own ranks. As they followed the evidence, one name kept coming up: Vito Moretti. Vito Moretti was a name that carried weight in the underworld. He had once been an associate of Sammy's, a trusted lieutenant who had helped Sammy expand his operations in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But in the years leading up to Sammy's disappearance, Moretti had grown disillusioned with Sammy's control and was rumored to be making moves to take over some of Sammy's territory. Theories circulated that Moretti had feared Sammy might turn on him, or that he was simply trying to take control of the lucrative extortion rackets in the city. Whatever the reason, investigators now had to decide whether Moretti had the motive to betray Sammy, or if he had just been a pawn in someone else's game. Further investigation revealed that Moretti had suddenly disappeared after Sammy's death. No one knew where he went, and no one ever spoke of him again. Was it possible that Moretti had been involved in Sammy's murder and then fled the scene? Or had he been the one to tip off the authorities, knowing that he would be a prime suspect? As the detectives honed in on Moretti, they began to piece together his connections within the Mafia. They found evidence that suggested Moretti had been in contact with several high-ranking members of the Gambino family shortly before Sammy vanished. But they also discovered that Moretti had been involved in several business deals that Sammy had never approved of. These deals were tied to illegal operations that had crossed some dangerous lines, and some of the families didn't take kindly to such breaches of trust. The more the investigators learned about Vito Moretti, the more they realized that Sammy's death wasn't as simple as a mob hit gone wrong. There were deeper layers to this story, layers that involved not just power struggles within the Mafia, but also corruption, betrayal, and long-held grudges. By now, it was clear that the truth about Sammy Donatello's death wasn't going to be easy to uncover. The Mafia's grip on New York may have weakened over the years, but the old ways of silence and secrecy still held sway. The people who knew what happened to Sammy Donatello were either dead, too afraid to speak, or too powerful to be brought to justice. For the detectives working the case, every lead they followed seemed to circle back to Vito Moretti. The investigation had opened old wounds and unearthed painful truths that some people had hoped would remain buried. But with every new discovery, the case began to feel less like a murder mystery and more like the final chapter of a long-running Mafia saga, one that had been buried for over 60 years. As detectives continued to dig into the life of Sammy Donatello, they realized that the Mafia of the 1960s wasn't just about power and money. It was also about loyalty and betrayal. Sammy had made enemies, but he had also made allies who would do anything to protect their own interests. The deeper the investigation went, the more tangled it became. Sammy's death wasn't just about a single man's rise and fall. It was a battle of allegiances, secrets, and buried grudges that stretched far beyond the walls of New York's criminal underworld. One name kept coming up as they pieced together Sammy's last years: Vito Moretti. He had been Sammy's right-hand man for a long time. Moretti had been a trusted lieutenant who helped Sammy expand his operations, from extorting businesses to taking control of illegal gambling rings. Sammy had always relied on Moretti's loyalty, but recently things had begun to shift. Moretti had become restless. He was ambitious, and ambition in the Mafia could be dangerous. As Sammy's power and influence grew, Moretti started to feel overshadowed. He wanted more control. It was a common story in the Mafia. Loyalty was one thing, but power was something else entirely. And when someone craved power, they were willing to do anything to get it. The first hint that something was wrong came a few months before Sammy disappeared. A few of Sammy's close associates noticed that Moretti had started making moves behind Sammy's back. He was meeting with people Sammy would never have trusted, members of rival families, former associates who had been pushed out of Sammy's organization. He was trying to form his own network, independent of Sammy's control. But Sammy was always several steps ahead. He had eyes and ears, everywhere. As Moretti's ambition grew, so did Sammy's suspicions. But Moretti wasn't the only one who had designs on Sammy's territory. In fact, investigators soon realized that the Gambino family, led by the respected and feared Carlo Gambino, had been keeping a close eye on Sammy. With the pressure from law enforcement increasing, some in the Gambino family might have seen Sammy as a liability. He was too powerful, too influential, and his connections to both law enforcement and the Mafia made him a dangerous figure. Sammy had always maintained his neutrality, working with all the families, but now that balance was starting to crack. The Gambinos, already a powerful force in the city, had much to gain from taking Sammy out of the picture. But it wasn't just the Gambinos who wanted Sammy gone. There were others who saw an opportunity in Sammy's absence, and they weren't afraid to take it. As the investigation continued, it became clearer that Sammy's death wasn't a spontaneous act. It had been carefully planned. His body had been concealed in the Lincoln Continental and buried under concrete in a warehouse, hidden away from the eyes of the law for decades. But who had orchestrated such a plan? Detectives began to focus on Moretti again. After all, he had disappeared without a trace right after Sammy's body was buried. Theories emerged that Moretti had been the one to orchestrate Sammy's murder, either because of his ambition to take control or because he was afraid Sammy would turn on him. But was Moretti acting alone, or was he part of a bigger conspiracy? The detectives found that Moretti had been in contact with several key figures in the Mafia just before Sammy disappeared. He had connections with the Gambino family, and he had also been dealing with certain high-ranking members of the Genovese family. This made Moretti's involvement in Sammy's murder even more suspicious. He was in the right place at the right time, and he had the motive to strike. But there was a problem. No one had seen Moretti since Sammy's death. He had vanished without a trace. Some speculated that he had gone into hiding, while others believed he had been taken out by someone else, fearing that he knew too much. As the investigation into Moretti's disappearance deepened, the detectives discovered that he had left New York shortly after Sammy's body had been buried. But where had he gone? And why had he disappeared so suddenly? One theory was that Moretti had fled the country, taking refuge in a city where the Mafia still held sway, like Havana or Naples. But there was little evidence to support this. Moretti had always been a man who stayed close to home, and he wouldn't have disappeared without leaving a trace. His disappearance raised more questions than answers. Had he been silenced by those who wanted to keep the secret of Sammy's murder buried, or had he just run to avoid the consequences of his actions? While the detectives were looking into Moretti, they also began to interview other people from Sammy's past, old associates, business partners, and even rivals. They all had stories to tell, but none of them could fully explain what had happened to Sammy. The Mafia world in New York had changed over the years, and those who had once been close to Sammy were now scattered across the country, some still in the criminal world, others long out of it. But they all agreed on one thing. Sammy had been a man who demanded loyalty, and someone had betrayed him. Through the interviews, a picture began to emerge. Sammy had been dealing with more pressure than anyone knew. He had been trying to negotiate his future, looking for ways to stay on top in a world that was changing rapidly. The younger generation of mobsters, the ones who had grown up watching Sammy's rise, were no longer content with his leadership. They wanted more, and they were willing to do whatever it took to take it. The detectives also discovered that Sammy had been increasingly concerned about his safety in the months leading up to his disappearance. He had spoken to a few close associates about his fears of being taken out by someone within his own organization. He had trusted few people by then, and the ones he trusted most had already been placed under suspicion. With all of these revelations, the detectives began to feel like they were getting closer to the truth. They had the motive, the players, and the timeline. They just needed to find the final piece to put it all together. But with each passing day, it seemed that the answers were slipping further away, lost in the maze of silence and fear that still ruled the Mafia world. The case had become more than just the search for Sammy Donatello's killer. It was a battle against the secrecy and corruption that had kept the Mafia's darkest secrets hidden for so long. As the investigation continued, it became clear that some answers would never come. But for Sammy's family, for the people who remembered the man he had been before he disappeared, the truth was something worth fighting for, even if it meant uncovering more than they had bargained for. As the detectives moved forward, they knew one thing for certain. The truth about Sammy Donatello's murder was closer than ever. As the investigation into Sammy Donatello's death continued, the walls that had once protected the Mafia's secrets began to crack. New revelations pointed to a conspiracy larger than anyone had expected. With each piece of the puzzle, it became increasingly clear that Sammy's murder wasn't just the work of one man. It was the result of a coordinated effort involving several high-ranking figures from within the Mafia. Detectives started to focus more closely on the web of connections that Sammy had maintained throughout his life. His ability to work with every family had made him indispensable in New York's underworld, but it also made him a target. As the Mafia's power began to shift in the 1960s, new blood emerged in the form of younger, more ruthless mobsters. They were less interested in maintaining balance and more focused on grabbing as much power as possible. Sammy had been one of the few figures in the Mafia who could keep the peace between families, but this very skill may have sealed his fate. His success in managing the delicate alliances of the five families meant he had made enemies across the board. As law enforcement closed in on the Mafia, these enemies saw Sammy as the perfect scapegoat, a man who could be removed to destabilize the entire underworld. The investigation led detectives back to the scene where Sammy had been buried, beneath the floor of a warehouse on Water Street. The meticulous way his body had been concealed made it clear that whoever had planned this wanted to be sure Sammy would never return to threaten their ambitions. But what shocked the detectives the most was the realization that Sammy's murder was probably not just a matter of one family trying to eliminate a rival. It was likely the result of a betrayal from someone close to him, someone he had trusted. Detectives dug deeper into the movements of those around Sammy in the months leading up to his disappearance. One name in particular kept surfacing: Donato Dany Romano, a member of the Genovese family who had long been an ally of Sammy's. Dany had worked alongside Sammy for years, and their partnership had been built on mutual trust. But recently, Dany had been growing restless, just like Vito Moretti. He had been seen with several young members of the Gambino family, making deals that Sammy would never have approved of. Sammy had been warned about the growing threat from within his own ranks. He had confided in a few of his most trusted associates, expressing concern about people he thought were loyal to him. He knew the Mafia's code: loyalty was everything, and betrayal was punishable by death. But even Sammy, with all his experience, had underestimated how far his own people might go to secure their own power. As investigators pieced together Sammy's last days, they discovered that Dany Romano had been one of the last people to see Sammy alive. The pair had met in private a day before Sammy vanished. What was ours discussed in that meeting remained a mystery, but it was clear that Sammy's suspicions about his inner circle were justified. Dany had been acting strange in the days following the meeting, and sources claimed that he had been seen talking to Moretti, who had vanished after the murder. The deeper the investigation went, the more the detectives realized that Dany Romano may have played a key role in Sammy's death. Evidence surfaced suggesting that Dany had orchestrated the plan to take out Sammy, with the help of several other Mafia members who saw an opportunity to rise to power. But the detectives couldn't be sure of his exact involvement. Too many people had been involved in the conspiracy to kill Sammy, and the truth was hidden behind years of silence and fear. As investigators followed the trail, they learned that the decision to murder Sammy wasn't just about power, it was also about control. Sammy had been trying to secure his position in the changing landscape of New York's criminal underworld. He had been negotiating with members of the Gambino family, possibly seeking a deal to solidify his power and protect his empire from law enforcement. This move was seen as a betrayal by some of his closest associates. They feared that Sammy would abandon them for the Gambinos, weakening their hold over the city. The truth about Sammy's murder wasn't just about a single act of violence. It was about a complex series of betrayals, shifting alliances, and calculated decisions that led to the eventual removal of one of the Mafia's most powerful figures. It was about how fear and ambition could destroy loyalty and change the course of New York's criminal history. Despite all the evidence and theories, one question remained. Why was Sammy's body hidden so meticulously? Why was his death so carefully concealed? As the investigation continued, detectives began to realize that Sammy's murder wasn't just about getting rid of a rival, it was about making a statement. The people who orchestrated his death wanted to send a message to anyone else who might think of challenging the old order of the Mafia. Sammy's body had been buried beneath concrete, not just to hide the evidence, but to erase any trace of his influence and to make sure that no one would ever ask questions about what had happened to him. As the years passed, the truth about Sammy Donatello's death continued to unfold piece by piece. The investigation into his murder was finally coming to a close, but it wasn't the closure that many had hoped for. For the detectives working the case, the real lesson wasn't just about solving the crime, it was about how deeply corruption and loyalty ran in the Mafia, and how the consequences of betrayal could echo through the decades. In the final stages of the investigation, several key individuals involved in Sammy's life and death had either passed away or disappeared into the shadows of the underworld. The men who had orchestrated his murder, including Dany Romano and others close to him, had evaded justice, either by dying or living with their guilt in silence. No one would ever truly know who had been the mastermind behind the plan to take Sammy out, but it was clear that the conspiracy had reached the highest levels of the Mafia. The most tragic part of the story was that Sammy Donatello, a man who had once been at the top of New York's criminal empire, was now reduced to a figure from the past. His name, once feared and respected, had become just another footnote in Mafia history. His murder had been swept under the rug by those who wanted to forget the old ways, as the power structures of New York's underworld shifted and changed with the times. Sammy had been buried under the concrete floor of that warehouse for 60 years, a silent witness to the secrets that had driven the Mafia to collapse in on itself. His body, preserved in the Lincoln Continental, was no longer just a mystery. It was a symbol of a world that had been slowly dying. The old mob families, once so powerful, had lost their grip on New York. The younger, more ambitious criminals who had betrayed Sammy were now facing their own fates, often behind bars or dead from the violence they had once embraced. For those who remembered Sammy as a man of honor, the discovery of his body was bittersweet. It brought some closure, but it also brought the harsh realization that the world they once knew was gone. Sammy had fought to maintain control, to keep the delicate balance between the families, but in the end, it was the betrayal from within that had cost him everything. The final chapters of Sammy's life and death were never fully written, and the answers to many of the questions surrounding his murder remained locked away in the hearts and minds of those who had lived through that dark time. But for Sammy's family, the truth was enough to finally allow them to mourn properly. His wife, Maria, who had lived in uncertainty for decades, could now say goodbye to the man she had once loved. His children, who had grown up without their father, could finally lay to rest the mystery of his disappearance. In 2025, the Lincoln Continental was carefully removed from the warehouse, and the body inside was exhumed. Forensic experts examined the remains, confirming what had long been suspected. Sammy Donatello had been murdered, shot in the head and chest, likely during an ambush. His killers had taken great care to make sure his death was permanent, burying him beneath layers of concrete so that no one would ever find him. It was a perfect crime, at least for a time. As the investigation wrapped up, it was clear that the Mafia's reign in New York was over. The once feared families had been weakened by law enforcement, internal divisions, and changing times. Sammy's story, however, would be remembered as one of the last great mysteries of the old guard, a story of power, betrayal, and the heavy cost of ambition in the Mafia world. The warehouse on Water Street, where Sammy had been buried for so long, was eventually torn down and replaced with modern apartments, a stark reminder of how much had changed. The ghosts of the past, including Sammy Donatello, faded into the history of the city, leaving behind only whispers and rumors of a time when the Mafia ruled New York. The men who had once controlled the city's streets had been replaced by a new generation, and the legacy of the old Mafia was slowly erased from the public eye. But for those who had lived through it, the memory of Sammy Donatello would remain a part of New York's criminal history. His death, once a dark secret buried beneath concrete, would never be forgotten. It served as a reminder of the price of loyalty, the danger of ambition, and the inevitable fall of those who once thought they were untouchable. In the end, Sammy Donatello's legacy wasn't just about the crime he committed or the power he held. It was about the people he left behind, the family he had loved, the associates who had worked with him, and the enemies who had destroyed him. His story, like so many others in the Mafia, was a cautionary tale of the lengths people would go to for power, and the tragic consequences that followed. The mystery of Sammy Donatello's disappearance was solved, but the scars it left on New York's underworld would never truly heal. His story may have ended 60 years after his death, but the legacy of his life, his rise, and his tragic fall would echo in the city for years to come.